Hi, class. Chapter 3, Wolf Hollow. Lots of people crossed our farm to get from down the hollow to the houses on the other side of our fields, instead of following the road from the school all the way around the hill. I never minded. We knew everyone for miles around, but I was sometimes startled by the vagabonds who passed through from time to time. In those days, not so very long after the Great Depression, there were people who had taken up wandering and didn't know how to stop, cut loose from their roots and their people, never stopping anywhere for very long. And then there were those who had come home from the first big war, so shaken, so silent, that they didn't seem to know who they were any longer or where they belonged. One of them, a man named Toby, had stayed. He wasn't like the others. He didn't ask for money or food. He didn't ask for anything at all. But instead of drifting through on his way to somewhere else like the others, he circled the hills endlessly, and I confess that I had been nervous about him in the beginning. But that's before I had come to know him. I looked for him as I walked home that day, scanning the field that wrapped itself along the long, low hill like a nubby shawl. I often saw him away in the distance as I made my way to school and home again. He liked to stand at the edge of the woods, still as a tree, or on the very top of the hill, clear against the sky. We didn't know where Toby had come from or much about him, except that he had been a foot soldier, fighting the Germans in France decades earlier. That much we'd heard in passing at church at the market, and took it to be true. His left hand, terribly scarred, seemed to confirm the story, but nobody knew for sure where he came from, except that he might have stopped in these hills because they reminded him of home. Or maybe they were simply like a place where he'd always wanted to be. A lot of people worried about Toby as he walked the woods and valleys in his long, black oilcloth coat and his black boots, long black hair and beard, and always 3 long guns slung across his back. They didn't know what to make of this largely silent man who never seemed to stop walking, morning to night, his head down, plodding along neither faster nor slower than he had the day before. I sometimes pictured him huddled in a trench while 1,000 Germans ran around topside with bayonets fixed and spikes on their helmets and bloodlust in their eyes. Even though I was only 11, I knew enough about fear to conclude that being completely afraid, body and soul, was probably enough to make a person strange forever after. And that's what Toby was, strange. Hard to know, but sometimes it's more than fear or shell shock that makes a man like he is, my grandmother told me one day, soon after Toby had first come to our hills. He wouldn't have been much more than a boy when he fought in that terrible war, but he must have seen and done things that would lay a strong man low. We'd heard that Toby was squatting in an old smokehouse in Cobb Hollow, down below the Glengarry place, along where we grew potatoes and corn. Nobody owned that smokehouse anymore, not since Silas Cobb had died and his old house burned up from a lightning strike. The smokehouse was set back away from the burned-out foundation of the house, mostly hidden in the trees and brush that had grown up around it. Page 24. It was a snug little place made of stone and wood with a metal roof. I'd come across it once when one of our cows went missing and we all scattered through the woods to bring her home. I knew better than to go inside the old shacks beyond the borders of our farm, some of them built up around oil well pumps, some of them for curing meat, some for fowl, all of them apt to attract snakes. But I'd explored the old smokehouse before Toby took it for his own. Except for the smell of meat and smoke that was still strong inside, it seemed a nice enough place for a man like Toby to live. And the old well at the nearby Cobb place, though nothing more than a hole in the earth, like the Cobb house itself, still meant water worth drinking when the nearby creek froze up. I could imagine Toby warm inside the smokehouse, a fire in the spot where fires had once burned steadily. Perhaps he used the meat hooks dangling from the rafters overhead to hang his coat when he wasn't in it, his guns when they weren't slung across his back. On one, his black hat, on another, his camera. We'd all been surprised when Toby had asked to borrow our camera, which was now his, more or less. It was amazing that he had spoken after all, that he had come close enough to us to make such a request, that he had suddenly seemed excited about something, especially something like photographs. But he had, and the whole thing had been an accident. When I was 7 and Henry 5, James 3, my mother had taken us to Horne's, the big department store in Pittsburgh, to have our portrait done. My mother had one picture of herself taken with her whole family shortly before her mother died. It was pressed in the family Bible, brown as summer dust. My father had many portraits of his forebears, a furious bunch of Scots, beetle-browed, mash-mouthed, goat-eyed. But nowhere in her house was there a simple picture of any of us smiling, arm in arm. My mother wanted such a thing of her children, so she took the 3 of us to Horne's and had us sit together for a portrait. The photographer told her that all portraits taken that month would be entered into a contest for a Kodak camera and a lifetime supply of film and processing. "And when would I have time to take pictures of anything?" she said, smiling as she paid the man. 3 weeks later, when a package arrived for my mother, we were astonished to find that it contained both our portrait, in which we all looked sweeter than we really were, and the news that we had won the camera. It was also enclosed, along with a dozen spools of film to get us started, and some special envelopes for sending them in to be developed. Page 26. It was as if we had received a tiny spaceship or a time machine. So astounding was this gift. Word soon spread, and before long, our neighbors were dropping in Sunday afternoons, still in their church clothes, angling for pictures. My mother was too busy to oblige them. Aunt Lily was willing to take the pictures, but she was so bossy and critical of her subjects that they always looked as if they'd had the flu in their pictures. When people saw the results, they asked for another round with another photographer, which was a waste of film and time. I tried my hand in it, but I tended to lop off their heads. So people stopped coming after a while, and the camera gathered dust until one afternoon, when the peaches were in their brief blossom, and the sun behind them made a rosy miasma of the orchard. I took the camera to try to save the sight. I stood at the top of the orchard and took one picture after another, lowering the camera in between to sigh and breathe the chill pink air. At some point, I became aware of Toby standing off to one side, near the outermost trees, watching me. I'd never spoken to him, had always found myself at least a field away from him until now. And I'd never known him to watch a person the way he was watching me, to stand still for so long in one place. I slowly pointed the camera in his direction, expecting him to shy from it as if it were a gun, but he didn't. I took his picture, even though through the lens from such a distance he looked like nothing but a smudge of darkness in that hat. When he began to walk toward me, I waited. It was full light out, and I was on my own farm. There was no reason to be nervous. That's what I told myself. But I was only 9 back then, too young to be very brave. Toby was a tall man who never smiled, seldom spoke, had those terrible scars on his hand, and those guns. I could hear someone hammering something in the distance, probably my father, fixing siding on the barn. The sound kept me where I was as Toby walked up to me. When he was a dozen feet away, I became aware of the smoke and meat smell coming off him, mixed with his own scent. It wasn't entirely unpleasant, but it was overlaid with the stink of kerosene from his lamp. Whenever the dogs got near him, they'd shake their heads and sneeze. He looked at the camera and then at me. "Is that yours?" he said. "My mother's," I thought about a minute. And mine. It was, after all, my picture that had won the camera. Mine and James's and Henry's. Toby hitched his gun belt higher on his shoulder. I'd held a gun before. 3 must have been very heavy. His black coat, long and stiff, had a high collar that framed his neck and made him look bigger than he was, like some animals will rough up their fur for purposes of warfare. "You taking pictures of the blossoms?" I nodded. "And you?" "Just one of you. Do you want it when it comes in?" Toby shook his head. "I know what I look like." I wondered how many years it had been since he'd seen himself in a mirror. He was staring at the camera. I took the strap from around my neck. "You want to try?" I held the camera out toward him. Toby glanced at me and then away, at me again and away at the blossoms, then back over his shoulder toward the fields just plowed for planting. At a line of blue spruce higher than anything else for a mile. He walked close, took the camera, stepped back. "I'll bring it back tomorrow, if that's all right." I was a little startled. From saying nothing to me, ever, to now taking his liberty was surprising. But I didn't know how to say no, not to an adult, and I didn't think my mother would mind. She often made an extra loaf of bread or pot of jam for Toby. She wasn't scared of him. He didn't think she'd mind if he'd use the camera for a day. And so that was the beginning of a change in our lives. Had we not won the Kodak, had the peach blossoms been less beautiful that year, had Toby been elsewhere on his walk that day, had I fled from the sight of him, had I said no, Toby would not have learned how to take the pictures he took and eventually been given the camera for his own. Nor would I have come to know him as I did, and he me. We would have been spared trouble if we had not crossed paths that day. But it's important to look at how everything ended and not just what happened along the way.